you've been beyond peak capacity for about 18 months now. It never cleared. And so it wasn't meant to handle this much stuff. We didn't build for that kind of capacity. So what you've seen is mounting delays that build in.
And you have seen over the last more than a decade, China working hard to stop just being Asia's assembler of goods that it ships out and being the source of technology and sort of the more value-added parts of all of it.
Welcome to Network 2020's audio edition of this virtual event. Be sure to check out our other events, media, and videos at network2020.org.
Welcome and Happy New Year, everyone. I hope you all had happy and healthy holidays. My name is Courtney Doggart, and I'm the president of Network 2020. We are an inclusive international community that highlights and drives innovative solutions to challenges in international affairs. If you are not familiar with our work, please feel free to check us out on our website. We do a number of different programs, and including these briefings. We also run research abroad, and we're hosting programs for the State Department. So a lot of interesting work. Please do follow us on social media and check out our website. So as we come off of this giving season, some of you, like me, might still be waiting on some gifts to arrive, and not because of last minute shopping. But I think as we've all realized that the turmoil of the past few years has demonstrated not the fragility of our systems, because I don't think that it's fragile, and I think we'll hear a little bit more about that, but of the exposure to any number of shocks. And these systems affect everyone from including producers and small business owners and consumers and investors. And so we really wanted to take a look with two experts at how we got here and what does it take to get back toward a more predictable system, and how are policymakers really grappling with that. So I am so pleased today to have Phil Levy. He's the chief economist at Flexport and former senior economist for trade for President George W. Bush's Council of Economic Advisors, and Shannon O'Neill, who is Vice President and Deputy Director of Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and the author of the forthcoming book, The Globalization Myth, Regionalization and How America's Neighbors Help It Compete. They're both here to talk about these issues today. So welcome, Shannon, welcome, Phil. Thank you so much for being here with us today. To start off, Phil, I just want to turn to you first for a little bit of a scene setter. What the heck happened? And what are some of the theories that you're hearing, and what are the implications for returning to a robust supply chain? So what is it that you're taking a look at right now?
Yeah, well, thank you, Courtney. It's a great pleasure to be here with you all. So in a very unimaginative approach for an economist, I'm going to talk about supply and demand. Supply and demand for moving stuff around the world specifically. And I'm actually going to start with demand. Because I think that's actually where more of the story lies. So when we started into the pandemic, I think people weren't confident they knew exactly what was going to happen, but they probably pulled out a pretty familiar playbook. The playbook is, got it, sharp recession. In a sharp recession, incomes go down and consumption goes down. So people just consume less of everything. Why does it matter what they perceive? Well, it means things like, the carriers who move containers across the ocean say, we better cut back on some of our lines and our stops because demand is going to drop, but we don't want to see prices crater. And others who make plans, automobile manufacturers, how many chips do you order? You see all these things heading down. Well, for part of the economy, an important part of the economy, it played out sort of the way we expected. If you look at the services sector, you saw a very sharp drop, and it's been a very long, slow, gradual recovery. The thing that was a really big surprise, that was not at all what we expected, was that wasn't what happened in the goods sector. In the goods sector, you had an initial drop, and then you had a boom. And it's a boom that has lasted throughout. It has changed a bit qualitatively over time. Initially, you saw durable goods, those things that last 3 or more years. They were leading the way initially, switched a bit to non-durables. But this consumption of goods went up by a lot. And what I mean that, I mean, for every dollar that people were spending on personal consumption expenditures, they had for a very long time spent a pretty consistent fraction on goods. It was something around 31.5%. That moved almost not at all. It would go up or down by 0.2. All of a sudden, we saw that at 34, 35%. Huge switch. And we have some idea why, right? It's everybody's stuck at home and you can't go to the theater or travel or do whatever you might have done. So it's not a mystery, but it meant that we were consuming a lot. You coupled that with a lot of income support. That federal policy stepped in. You had very aggressive monetary policy, very aggressive fiscal policy. So if you look at the personal income statistics, it never went down from March 2020. Every single month since March 2020 was higher than that initial month. So you had more income and then a greater fraction being devoted towards goods, which meant you had a system under strain. So that's the demand side of things. Let me turn to the supply side of things, which is what most of the coverage is focused on: ports and ships and planes and what's happened with all of this. It's worth keeping in mind, this is a system that costs a lot. And for any expensive system like this, you kind of build it for peak capacity. You say, I'll be all right on peak, and then maybe I'll make up the difference, before or after. If you want to think about this, think about like airports around Thanksgiving, right? Your worst day is sort of the day before Thanksgiving. Some people miss their flights, they bump a little bit, but you kind of clear everything eventually. For the logistics system, that would be essentially the time leading up to the holidays, from say about September to early December, peak season. That's when things are crazy. The rest of the time you make it up. Well, you had a couple things happen to the logistics sector. One, you've been beyond peak capacity for about 18 months now. It never cleared. And so it wasn't meant to handle this much stuff. We didn't build for that kind of capacity. So what you've seen is mounting delays that build in. The other thing is, of course, it was affected by the pandemic itself. So you've had port closures. You've had, one of the things, the air cargo is a complete mess. Now, actually, more than perhaps any time during the pandemic. But because when you can't have flight crews move through, then you don't have flights and you don't move cargo on those. But the thing that had been hitting it before was when people stopped doing international travel, roughly half of air cargo moved in the bellies of passenger planes. So what you had was a system under a lot of strain, demand way up, supply down of moving these services. And that meant higher prices and lots of delays.
Thank you. That is a very good overview. You touched on policies in there, and so I'm going to use that as a segue to you, Shannon, to dig into some of the policies. And so, how are we building resilience into this new normal, whether it is a new normal? And you've written a lot about some measures in your in a recent Foreign Affairs article. About some trade policies that may or may not be counterproductive. And so, in your opinion, what should policymakers be doing to develop a more robust global supply chain, or at least get us back on track?
Sure, and like Phil, it's a real pleasure to be with you here today. I think partly just stepping back is the question about resilient to what, right? So one kind of resilience is that the store shelves are full and our e-commerce, things get delivered before the holidays, right? That's one kind of resilience. And there's certain policies that help do that. But there's other kinds of resilience that policymakers and all of us are talking about it. One is national security resilience, right? And so if we are worried about one country, for instance, controlling all rare earth refiners and, which are, defense industry, as well as our basic commercial every technology. In fact, what we're doing right now and able to talk to each other, all that depends on that. So there's a resilience to having access to, rare earths, as well as a whole host of other things. That's another kind of resilience. Another kind of resilience is slowing climate change and global warming. And so can you bring in policies to supply chains that will, allow us to address the real challenges there? That is another kind of resilience. And then, as we've seen over the last almost 2 years now, there's a health resilience too. Do you have the kinds of equipment that you need to make your population, safe and healthier than it might otherwise? And there's a whole bunch of other types. So I think policymakers in many ways have expanded the aperture, and there's really different policies that matter for different things. And so if you are just focused on let's make sure the shelves are full and e-commerce works and all of that, then some things are being addressed, right? We're talking about the Build Back Better plan or some of the infrastructure plan that went in. There's money in there, right? There's $17 billion for ports to sort of upgrade the ports. There's another 100 billion plus for roads and rails and bridges, and U.S. infrastructure definitely needs an overhaul. We haven't been investing as much as we should from the 1980s on, and particularly the last couple of decades. So that is a big part of it. Another way to increase that resilience is automation, is bringing in the kinds of platforms that Flexport has, right? Making sure that things move more efficiently, that the routes that things go, that you have some real intelligence behind that, if it's artificial intelligence, but making those things work better. There are discussions about changing rules and regulations that, the way the trucking industry works and how things move in and out of ports, that kind of stuff too. All of that matters for that efficiency of movement around. But when you get to some of the other goals, right, the national security goals, the health goals, the climate change goals, maybe even the domestic equity goals and the like that a lot of governments have, including the current U.S. administration, then the policies, you end up sometimes having a little bit more of a trade-off. It's not just the win-win of, improve the infrastructure and things will move faster or more efficiently. It is, well, it might cost a little bit more, but we'll make sure in a pinch to have it. Right. That could be with, PPE, with protective equipment or masks. It might cost more to make them in Wisconsin than it does in China. But if borders close, then we'll make sure that we have them here. Same thing with climate change. It might cost more to build the things here or to try to keep the technology behind, new hydrogen or solar or other kinds of green transition technologies. But then at least we'll have control over it, or we might be, a dominant player in those sort of races. But there are costs for innovation, there's costs for access and the like. I do think as we look back at history, one thing with supply chains on a lot of these different measures is looking to the Goldilocks middle. So not too close and not too far. And when you get too close, you actually introduce huge vulnerabilities. And, we saw this in the United States a few years back when Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico. And a few months afterward, you couldn't find saline bags and scalpels and a whole host of medical equipment in U.S. hospitals because they were all made on the island of Puerto Rico. Now, Puerto Rico is part of the United States, but that geographic concentration made it very vulnerable and made our medical system very vulnerable to disruption. So you don't want it too close. But as we've seen over this last couple of years, too far, spread out too far where you don't know where things are coming from, you can also lead to bottlenecks. And, the kinds of things Phil was talking about, sort of the challenges of shipping across oceans or not having, air traffic and having those planes out there makes it much harder if things are far, far away. So I think there's a lot of issues here that frankly policymakers are grappling with, but it's hard because there's a lot of trade-offs in what you're actually trying to resolve for.
Great, thank you. Jumping off from there, just talking a little bit, Phil, about decoupling. In one of your recent articles, you argue that decoupling from China may challenge or cripple U.S. technology leadership instead of fixing problems with the supply chain. Could you talk a little bit about that, and also how does technology factor into this whole situation?
Yeah, thank you. I think this gets to the heart of how people might think about global supply chains and globally distributed production. That there's sometimes a tendency to think that it's the good and you will make the good either, as Shannon said, too near, too far, just right, but you find your place and you make the good. And we'll think about sort of technological prowess as, do I have the right patents? Have I mastered the techniques? Do I have the scientific know-how to do these things? I would suggest a different way of thinking about this, which is that the way that that it's certainly important to have mastered the science, no doubt about that. But then there's a question of, can we make something at an affordable price? Is this a viable product? And usually the people who end up as sort of the technological leaders, if you want to think about say, Apple with an iPhone, right? Why do we carry them? Well, they do a lot of cool things. It's great. That's very nice. And, other products are fine too. I'm not endorsing, but, but if it cost $5,000 a phone, they wouldn't have anywhere near the penetration and the sort of common uptake. So how does one get that? Well, one gets that by tapping into the sort of abilities and the offerings from the whole rest of the world. So essentially, that's how you are a successful technological leader, is you tap in both the expertise. So sometimes that's producing someplace where they can make a part cheaply that lets you meet a price point. Sometimes it's not that another place even has a technological advantage per se. It might just be that there's really big fixed costs to producing something, like say a computer chip or specializing in, avionics wings, not for your phone, mind you, but we're talking about planes. Whatever it may be, it's, somebody has to invest $1 billion in a factory to do this, and you save a lot of money if you do that one time instead of 10 times, that you let somebody specialize. So I think that's how modern technological leadership works. There's this idea with decoupling, which is that the US has some concerns about China. Those aren't always precisely specified, but everybody sort of winks and says, we know what you mean. So I'll play on that for the moment. But the US has some concerns about China. So what we'll decouple, we'll cut off from China. What does that mean exactly? Does that mean that we won't directly source from China? You could try that. It puts one at a disadvantage in that. But then you also have a very quick follow-on question, which is, it's not, I just get a good from China. You might say, well, I'm going to get this from, Vietnam instead. Well, a lot of production in Vietnam uses Chinese parts. Or you may get it from Germany, and Germany uses Chinese parts. If you cut yourself off from all of that, then you've really isolated yourself and you're very unlikely to be a technological leader. If you don't, well, it's not quite clear where you're drawing the line or what you're achieving.
What I love about this conversation is that it shows how, what we're thinking about it just in terms of supply chain and goods is such a reflection of the geopolitical landscape that we're operating in. And so Shannon, just turning to you for the next question, how do you see the international political landscape shifting when we come out of this crisis? And does it pertain to this crisis alone? Because what I like about what you are saying is you're talking about not just the supply chain, but also national security, about things like climate change. Can you elaborate on what adjustments you see happening, and how do the policies follow the geopolitics or vice versa?
Sure. I mean, I do think it's an interesting time, and many of these changes were happening over the last decade and picking up steam. I think the pandemic has accelerated them in many ways. And I see them being pretty sticky as we come out the other side. And I think the biggest fundamental change over the last decade is that, rightly or wrongly, governments around the world believe in industrial policy again, right? They believe in their ability, they have a confidence in their ability to shape economies in the ways that they think are useful to them or to their country through various public economic tools. Right now, whether that's total hubris or whether they have some reality there, we'll find out. But I do think we're seeing this, and it's not just, many Asian countries have done this for a long time, and their economic development path had never really stopped doing it. The U.S. has tended to do it in ways we didn't talk about industrial policy, but now we're actually talking about industrial policy. But Europe has been doing this and is reactivating it under this rubric of strategic autonomy that they have out there. And then I think other countries will follow along as well. So we're seeing this proliferation of mechanisms, whether it's government contracts, whether it's subsidies, whether it's tariffs, whether it's a whole host of tax credits and expenditures and the like. There's a whole host of things that governments are doing, and I think whether or not they do it well, whether or not it is good or bad or counterproductive or not, because they have so many goals. It's not just economic growth, right? It's national security, it's health, it's climate, it's education, it's all kinds of stuff. They have a confidence in what they're doing. So I think that is here to stay for the 2020s. And then really the question is, what does this mean, right? And where does it take us, right? And so I think There are some very laudable reasons that they're doing this, right? And one, for instance, we see around the world is we see a lot of governments stepping in, not just suggesting, but beginning to regulate or set legislation around environmental, social, and governance issues, right? ESG issues, as they say. So you have Europe is going to set out a whole set of supply chain due diligence rules and regulations over the next year or two, and that will be sort of an important step. The SEC is starting to do that as well, asking for disclosures of companies. You're starting to see it in lots of different ways, and you may see more within the U.S. framework as well. And that, I think, in many ways, there's a lot of, you're seeing legislation in the United States, for instance, legislation that is assuming that any product that's coming out of the province of Xinjiang in China, has to prove that it's not being made with forced labor, is not, part of that situation there, and the challenges that province has. So I think we're going to see more and more of this, right? And that will have an effect on the way companies do business if they're doing it across borders, if they have supply chains and the like. What I think this will mean, and I think there's some lessons actually from the voluntary pledges that companies, especially big multinational companies, have made over the last decade. So one of these is there's a whole host of companies, particularly consumer companies, that made a pledge a decade ago to stop deforestation in their supply chain. So, Mars Candies and Nestle and Carrefour and a whole bunch of others. And I think there's some lessons as they tried to understand really where their products came from, the things that go into their foods. And they tried to police it and make sure that it was done in sustainable and socially, upstanding ways. And so one of those was that they needed to just have fewer suppliers, right? So for instance, Mars Candies, they looked at their palm oil mills and suppliers. They had over 1,500. They just couldn't tell where things were coming from, so they reduced it to less than 100. So you're going to see, I think, a shrinking in the number of suppliers as you try to meet either these voluntary pledges that many companies have made, but particularly as governments put in requirements and rules that you have to follow, mandatory rules. So one is reducing the number of suppliers. The other thing you saw in the deforestation, approach was that they reduced the number of countries, and some countries became very difficult to work within, even with as many checks and balances and investments that they tried to make. And so, that I think leans towards countries like the United States or Europe or others that have a quote unquote cleaner record on some of these issues, makes it harder for places that are more opaque. And I think you will continue to see this. And in fact, just in the last few weeks, you've seen companies like H&M or some of the Sainsbury, other European supermarkets say they'll no longer buy beef from Brazil because they just can't tell where it came from and that those supply chains are clean. So I think as we go forward and we look at governments putting more things in place and making it mandatory, we will see some shifting around in supply chains that, frankly, the pandemic and all the terrible things that Phil talked about, this huge surge in demand and the challenges of supply, may not have done. We will start seeing some of that happen in some industries because of these rules and regulations.
Great, thank you. And so trying to take this full circle back to you, Phil, with this idea of supply and demand, and then tying it into what Shannon just mentioned, which are these policies that are designed to achieve other goals that countries might have. How do you see this shaking out down the road? How long will the actual supply demand issue be a problem? But then taking into account what Shannon just mentioned, what do you see coming in the years ahead? And what are the signals that for you that show that we're headed in the right direction?
Oh, that's a lot. All good. And Shannon gave a very rich and good overview, I think, of what's happening on the policy scene. So let me break it into two parts: what's happening and what's likely to happen. I think if we are looking to see when does this current sort of shipping crisis resolve, you can break things into a few buckets. One is let's just take the stuff we have. What are measures we can do to make things more efficient? That's a lot of the stuff you're hearing. This White House task force will keep ports open 24/7. I think some of that stuff is quite constructive, can have a little effect at the margin, but that's not going to clear the crisis. I don't think we're going to clear the crisis because all of a sudden we get a whole fleet of container ships delivered. There are orders. Actually, it's all backed up. It just takes a while to do these things. And so we're not going to have new ports and new fleets coming to save the day. So really, it's going to be, when do we see a back off in demand? And I think there's a couple of ways we can get that. We can get that with You have, income that backs off. That could be because there's less support, for example, less fiscal support. It could be because there's a downturn. It could be there's monetary changes. It could also be because people change their preferences back. That could be because we fixed the health situation, which would be very nice for all of us, for other reasons. But you fix the health situation, and if, not a given, but if people say, you know what, I want to go back to restaurants and gyms again, and never mind the exercise machine that's sitting up in my attic. If they do that and they start spending on services, that would also relieve pressure. When is that going to happen? This is something we're trying to track at Flexport. We try to use some data for it, not in the next few months that we're seeing. And it's hard to see it actually happening this year, partly because not only do we have this overwhelming current demand, but there's a backlog. That you've got a lot of things that were sort of waiting to be shipped, and you essentially need to have that clear, and it has to clear outside of a normal peak period, assuming that we're going back to the old cycles. So the odds that we sort of get everything cleared, even if everything changes that way, and obviously we're in the midst of a new wave here, not seeing the backside of COVID, which we would like. So the odds that we see that this year seem pretty low. So unfortunately, that's not a happy story. Let me switch gears a little bit and talk about the sort of policy things and what the implications are of the kind of stuff that Shannon talked about. And I wanted to raise a few points here, which I think are complementary to what she said. So the first is something to keep in mind about businesses and supply chains, which is that businesses do not have perfect visibility into their supply chains. And there's a reason for this. This isn't just negligence on their part. It's if you're somebody who's making, say, a final consumer product, and you've got first-tier suppliers who have their own suppliers and their own suppliers and their own suppliers, those first-tier suppliers don't like to tell you where they're buying all those stuff. Why? They don't want to get cut out of the system, right? Hey, there's a way I can save some money. I just cut them out and I go directly to their suppliers. So you've got very limited knowledge, and it's also a pretty big technical thing to try to keep tabs on where every single part was made. It's just plain costly. So the point is, you're sometimes seeing a lot of the policy being formulated, some of the steps in Europe, we're playing with some of the stuff in the United States, which often presumes a level of knowledge on the part of business that isn't there. It might be achievable, it's costly to achieve. The second point I would make is, Shannon talked about how we might limit the number of suppliers as we sort of carve out, we don't do the ones who are engaged in deforestation or other things. I would just say, that may well, I don't disagree with her that could be the trend, but there's costs to each of these trends. The reason we have these globally diversified supply chains in the first place is not because somebody thought, wouldn't it be much easier if I just had a factory, off in Asia, and I have to do all my calls at the margin of the day, and I'm trying to manage things thousands of miles apart? No, they did it because it cut costs, because consumers said, I don't want to pay so much, and I'm more likely to buy this product if it's cheaper. And so they do comparisons, and you might say, well, do I produce this in Vietnam or do I produce this in Mexico? Mexico's closer if you're in the United States. There's a lot of ease there, but the cost is not the same. And so those same trade-offs are going to be there. So first thing was knowledge. Second thing is cost. Third thing and last thing I will point out on this is, going back to my old policy days, it is worth thinking what kind of rules we're thinking about for the global trading system. Are you doing this kind of stuff under the auspices of the World Trade Organization, or are you saying we're just going to ignore the WTO? The WTO is a great institution that's been significantly weakened. It's a lot more feasible to say you're going to ignore it now. I think it's a bad idea, but it's a lot more feasible than it was. We should note the WTO has taken a stand, the dispute settlement system, on issues that are similar to things like some of this supply chain regulation. If you go back and look at some rules on country of origin labeling with meat, where if you say, I'm going to do things that disproportionately burden imports and things which might seem innocuous, like information requirements, it was found, no, if that really puts importers at a cost disadvantage, that's not compatible with the rules. That's an oversimplification. You can go read some of the more detailed stuff. But there is a concern here that a lot of these things will be taken as the basis for protectionism, and we might also have a very different, more costly world if we see a breakdown there. So those are a few thoughts.
Thank you. You handled a lot quite well, so I really appreciate it. I'm going to start to turn to the audience Q&A box. So if you're listening and if you have any questions, please do put them in the Q&A box, and I will try to get to as many of them as I can. So the first one, Shannon, I will direct to you, and it's actually a question that's come up a couple of times, and I'm going to try to paraphrase a little bit, but two questioners want to know about China's role in the supply chain and whether or not there's any sort of risk in China sort of cutting off her nose to spite her face in supply chain and not wanting to supply, say, inexpensive technology components or rare earth minerals. Is there a risk in the supply chain, or is there enough interdependence? What are you seeing? Is when it comes to the national security risk?
Sure. Well, I think the answer is yes and yes. There is a risk, and yes, there's interdependence. But you have seen, we talk a lot about U.S. policies and U.S. policies trying to push decoupling, and U.S. policies putting Chinese companies on blacklists or stop export controls to stop particular technologies from being sold to China and the like. But China is changing its policies as well. And you have seen over the last more than a decade, China working hard to stop just being Asia's assembler of goods that it ships out and being the source of technology and sort of the more value added parts of all of it, right? And you actually see increasingly Chinese foreign direct investment, so Chinese investment going out, particularly into Asia, but around the world. So selling the more value added inputs that then might get assembled in Vietnam or Malaysia or other places, Cambodia and other places around it. So I do think you see China trying to change its own model. So one, making itself more valuable in that chain, but two, also limiting its trade, frankly, and limiting its exports, right? So you look at Chinese trade to GDP, it has not grown as fast as China's GDP has, right? It's looking more internally at its market. And I think there's some in China who would take the bet that, we have 1.4 billion people. They have a better chance of cutting themselves off than we have a chance of cutting ourselves off, I think, from China in many ways. And you see a lot of their, made in China 2025, or now what they call indigenous innovation, where they are trying to do that as well. So I think it's not just, now, one question is, are both countries starting to do this? I think the question is, the answer is both are doing it. It's not just the US, China's also doing this. Now, the other question is, can you actually do this? And this is where I think it's much more complicated. And, you're cutting off your nose. You might be cutting off more than your nose when you do this, both in just the immediate terms, in terms of GDP growth and that kind of things, but also, and back to some stuff Phil was talking about in the innovation side, right? In the kind of, if China will cut itself off, it has a lot of great skills, it has a lot of great technologies, but it has had a very hard time, frankly, in moving up that sort of innovation path. And I think semiconductors are a perfect example of this. Is, for many years they've been trying to create their own high-end, cutting-edge technology in semiconductors, and it's been a very mixed result. They've thrown hundreds of billions of dollars at it, and they haven't been able to do what Taiwan or South Korea or Japan or other places around the world, or some of the European countries that make the machinery and the like. They haven't been able to do that yet. So I think there is an interdependence that they still have. You do hear in boardrooms and on investor calls and these kinds of stuff, a lot of talk about sort of dual supply chains, sort of China for China, and then the rest of the world for the rest of the world. And can you divide this off? And I do think there's some industries where that will be possible, right? I think there's other ones where it'll be quite hard on both sides. So it's hard for me to. There is an interdependence that I think would be very difficult to really end. But some areas I think you could start seeing a moving apart. And the other thing I would just say that China is doing that the United States is not yet doing, in my view, one thing is to put in subsidies or tariffs or things to block off and protect. The other thing is, with the WTO, where it is to turn to regional agreements. And you see many countries around the world over the last 5 years being really active in resetting the global trading architecture. And so lowering tariffs. So you have, you have the CPTPP, which lots of countries are part of. China has thrown its hat in the ring along with some others that it would like to join. You have China and Japan joining the, RCEP, this Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And those things are going to lower tariffs and other barriers for those that are within that group, and raise them for those, or increase the cost for those outside of it, of which the United States is outside of it. So I think there's other aspects that are happening here. It's not just these sort of tit for tat subsidies or tariffs or other kinds of things. It's sort of this rewriting of the global trading rules to let some in and others not. And that is something that, in my view, the United States has really been absent from, to our detriment over the last 5+ years.
Great, thank you. Our next question I'll direct to you, Phil, and it's from someone who's with the Virginia Economic Development Partnership. And he writes, I am always picky about reinvestments in our infrastructure. When we offer these sorts of stimuli, what sort of mechanisms or constraints has the government put in order to determine that enough modernization upgrades have met expectations? So when investing in infrastructure, how do you ensure that they're upgraded enough to meet expectations and for future planning?
Yeah, so this is a good question, and timely also as we're thinking about infrastructure. And I would note that even though we certainly have had that infrastructure bill passed, that question is still at play, because frequently the way these things work is if you look at the bill that did pass, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, there's such and such a commission will decide how this will be allocated. And so there's sort of roughly directed money, but it hasn't actually translated. I think it's a very good general question of how do we get a return on investment in our infrastructure? And it actually gets back to some of the stuff that Shannon was talking about earlier, which is return on investment in what sense? Are we just looking for sort of economic efficiency? Will our ports move up the rankings in terms of global, how much they can process? Are we looking for things that sort of address employment concerns or equality concerns or other matters? And I think that's what a lot of the challenge is with this, is that I agree with what Shannon said earlier. There's plenty of opportunity to do infrastructure upgrades and improvement, but there's a question of whether we are going to take a dispassionate sort of conventional economic approach to this and just look for return on investment. There's ways to do that. I mean, as sort of a technical matter, that's not especially hard. You can say, okay, if I invest in such and such a technology, currently my throughput is this, and then afterwards my throughput will be that. You can measure these things. You can say, what's the value of that, and calculate an ROI. But the part that really gets tricky, and where it's a good thing to keep asking this question, is what are the standards we're looking for? Is it that conventional one, or is it lots of other things that we want to put weights on?
Okay, great, thank you. We have a question, Shannon. I'll send this one to you. James Stillman wants to know, he states that Burma is the second largest rare earth supplier after China. Are we sufficiently aware in the US of supply chain vulnerabilities resulting from setbacks to the democracy movement there in Burma?
Right, so this gets at a couple of things. And one is, what is it that we care about, right? Do we want to buy things from a country that's increasingly undemocratic, right? And perhaps, labor rights and other kinds of political rights are not supported. So, how prominent is ESG? So that's one question, and that is a big challenge. The other question on the rare earth issue is that, lots of countries around the world have rare earths. They're not actually very rare, but they don't have rare earth refining. So, you have it in the ground, but you can't put it into your iPhone until you've refined it. And there you have, China is the dominant player that has a vast majority of refining capacity. And then there's a couple others in places, like Cambodia and others that also we have complicated relationships or things that we wish were not happening in terms of overall social and governance issues and the like. So this is back to the kind of resilience and efficiency trade-off, right? To be resilient on this, you could fund, the governments could step in, whether US governments or other governments, and fund the creation of rare earth refining in places where we like the way the governments work or treat people, and or are not, geopolitical tensions are not particularly high. And in fact, the US government has a whole bunch of tools that they can do things, and one is called the Defense Production Act, DPA, And the government is actually, the US government has actually used the DPA to help fund the creation of a rare earth refining facility in Texas right now. So, you're starting to see that is the resilient side. Now, economically, that may not be the most efficient side. And, I think Phil is totally right. There's this idea of resilience, but if you can't make things, faster, better, cheaper, then other places around the world will make them, will win out, right? And your facility will suffer unless it's always supported by government. It will never become sort of economically profitable in a global marketplace, which we exist within. So I think this is this particular case that he points out of Burma is where, a crux of one of these challenges. How do you think about these trade-offs? And so it may make sense for national security reasons and others to have some reserves, to have some facilities either in the United States or in allies. There's sort of, people throw out this term, not just nearshoring or offshoring, but friendshoring, right? Do you have things in places where that you have agreements where you could work together and share? And Europe is one of those places, and the European Union is funding rare earth refining in particular places because they too want to have access. So I think there's an opportunity for cooperation there that lowers the cost somewhat. But it is one of these trade-offs that you're going to see, and it's trade-offs not just in geopolitical tensions, but obviously as we think more about the sort of ESG things. Do we want to buy things from a government that represses its people?
Thank you. Phil, one of the audience members wants to know that they talk about how the automobile industry has been hit with a huge semiconductor deficit. And how do you think that the supply of automobiles, semiconductors, or other capital can be processed more efficiently? And what do you expect in the future for heavy capital industries?
I think it's a very good question, and I won't claim deep expertise on the auto sector, but I will say this. I think there's been a huge challenge for lots of businesses during this pandemic. Getting back to what I talked about at the beginning, where to run your business well, you need to make forecasts. You need to anticipate, what will my supplies look like? What's the demand for my product going to look like? Do I sign long-term contracts? Do I guarantee that supply? How do I approach this? It's been extraordinarily difficult to do that. As we've sort of seen, you think demand's going to go down, it goes up. I think the auto industry got caught in that there was a perception that they weren't going to have, there's going to be a dip in demand for autos, that they did not secure a supply of semiconductors, and that they were using a particular type, which was maybe not the most profitable type of semiconductors. So when they said, all right, no, don't hold our place in line, don't put us down for these orders, the semiconductor manufacturers said, okay. And meanwhile, they're getting deluged by orders for people who are doing, the video games and the teleconferencing stuff and all this others. So their order books fill up. And then when they go back and they say, oh, hold on, wait, people want cars. They really, really want cars. I need those chips, please. You gambled and you lost. And I don't think this is sort of a fundamental, I really like the way Shannon's been saying, resilience against what? That there's an element here of that's part of business, is if you, forecast, if you think it's going to be a really cool summer and it turns out to be really hot, you may have, you're not stocking enough ice cream cones. You do these things in advance. It's harder with cars than it is. They're using a lot of chips and it's much more complicated. But I think that's part of what's going on here. Is that it's not, and you saw, and there, as I've seen it, there have been differences between auto manufacturers in the extent to which, another decision that a manufacturer has to make is, do I, as a manufacturer, undertake chip production? And these are huge companies, huge global companies. So you can decide, do I do this in-house, or do I do this as an arm's length relationship with somebody? Different places have taken different approaches, and they've had different results, whether you decide to stockpile. So you've seen a range of business decisions and a range of outcomes. I don't know that it's a fundamental vulnerability, but it's what one would expect in times of very, very uncertain demand and very difficult forecasting.
Courtney, let me just add, I totally agree with that. And just a little data point on that. We just saw this week results come out from last year, and Toyota became the highest selling, biggest number of cars versus GM. And I think a big part of that was they had a different business strategy in terms of chips. And so they actually had cars on the lots when GM didn't.
Okay, interesting. Yes, thank you for putting some context around that. Shannon, I have another question from someone who wants to know about whether if the shift of production from China to other developing countries, will it affect China's supremacy in the international, trade realm? And what are the implications of that?
Well, I think it gets back to what is changing and what's driving the change. So I think China has been quite active itself in driving some of these changes. So many of its companies are going out, just as if you go back to the 70s, 80s, and 90s, Japanese and South Korean and Taiwanese companies poured into China. And set up shops and set up Foxconn and set up all these other places that made things, that used China as this sort of assembler. Now, I think you're seeing a bit the reverse. The Chinese, very established Chinese companies are going out and seeding operations particularly in Asia, throughout different countries in Asia, both on the kind of hard industrial, we make stuff, as well as the e-commerce side, right? Trying to get out there, and Tencent and Alibaba and others are going out with their own subsidiaries and trying to conquer those markets as well. So if it is China that is going out and seeding those operations and the like, then I don't think they lose. Right. In fact, their primacy maybe becomes even stronger because they are the ones doing it. And back to the kind of global trading architecture, I think they're being very active on that side, on a policy side, to give themselves to increase their dominance and or just their presence by giving themselves an advantage that the United States doesn't have, for instance, in terms of those trading rules or rules of origin within lots of Asian countries as well. So I think that's part of it. Now, if the pullback from China is not sort of the China strategy, either them going out or them pulling in and asking companies to come in and produce there, then it is sort of a challenge. And I think actually where some of these debates or contests are happening is places that we don't talk about quite as much. It's not just at the ports and it's not just at the factory level. It's at the very wonky global standards level. So it's these international bodies that are deciding, what kind of plug we use and, what kind of technology you use and what the protocol is that's going to be the basis for the next iPhone or the next, 6G and all these kinds of stuff. And that is a place where I think some of this primacy and dominance is still really playing out. That too is a place where the United States has really been maybe not absent, but has pulled back significantly in the last 4 years. We have not been sending our scientists to lots of these areas. We have not been submitting papers to talk about what standards should be out there. And this is a place where China has really doubled down and has really gone into a lot of those areas and sort of within these committees that make these big decisions. So as we think about the next 5 years, if you're going to have this sort of tensions, and if you're thinking about this kind of stuff, maybe less on the trade barriers and less on some of this stuff and more on, what are the rules of the game around the world, and what are the, basic fundamental technologies and rules and regulations and protocols that people are going to adopt? Because that's really, I think, where some of the primacy is going to come from.
That's fascinating. Thank you. Phil, someone wants to know, they write, U.S. port congestion is partially caused by a handful of consumer goods importers like Walmart, Costco, Amazon, et cetera, having sweetheart demurrage deals at the ports, essentially using the docks as warehouses. I don't know if this statement is true or not, so I will also turn that over to you. And they want to know whether or not this has been solved.
Yeah, I won't sort of attribute it to a handful of companies. I will say that they hit on something very real, which is that there's a lot of trouble sort of moving containers around through the ports. And one of the things that shows is the interconnectedness of the system is part of why just on the supply side, it's very hard to disentangle these problems, that it can be, and I'll just sort of share I'm somewhat new to this particular topic, so I'll share a little bit of what I've found. You might think, well, this is pretty easy. You just sort of return an empty, take a new one, and you have a trucker go in and out and it's fine. It doesn't work that way. Containers tend to belong to various shipping lines. There's different types. You need an appointment to do this. They start getting congestion. You start getting these areas filled up and there's just be limited places just to put the containers. And now you get to what should be fairly familiar to people who've dealt with a lot of traffic. You just get the gridlock where it's hard to move things around. It is an issue people have been focused on, but it's not a particularly easy one to solve. So you try to think, can you put things in different places? Are there ways to clear old containers, and what are you doing with the old containers? Some of what's happened here is it's had to do with wild swings in the prices of containers, which has meant, are people eager to sort of take the time to load them with the way they used to load them, and so are they moving on different circuits? When I say wild swings, I mean, a container that used to, perhaps I'll be more precise, a container that used to cost, say, $1,500 to move across the Pacific might be $15,000 or more to move across the Pacific. So, and that's over a period of a year or two that price changed. So that has left people really sort of struggling to sort of move. But I would take that that's where I started with. These are signs of a system that's overwhelmed, that it really was not designed to move this much through. And so I would say these are more symptoms than root causes.
And just to follow up, and this is actually a question that someone asked, and maybe we should have clarified it earlier, but how much of this crunch is international versus US specific? Is the US being hit harder?
Yeah, good question. So if you look, I talked a bit about and we have some research up on our website, flexport.com/research. So we've been tracking the US tilt towards goods in consumption, which is a very striking feature of the pandemic, what I described earlier. That's not a uniquely US feature, but the US exhibited it as strongly as any country save one. The UK actually had an even bigger tilt towards goods. But the OECD, I think, looked at 25 countries, and 23 of them had this sort of market tilt towards goods and away from services. But the US was sort of a more extreme version of this. In stuff that we're tracking, if you look at the amount of time, we have an indicator that we put out weekly, which is our best measure of the extent of the crisis. We call it the ocean transparency indicator, which is how long does it take from when something is ready at the factory to when it leaves its destination port. We do that for two different trade lanes. The trade lanes, we do it for the Trans-Pacific eastbound, which is basically from Asia to North America. And we do it for the Far East westbound, which is from Asia to Europe. And what you've seen is that both of those have elevated a lot. So that's getting at this question: is this just a U.S. phenomenon, or is it more international? That's international, and the stuff's interconnected because the shipping lines can decide to move ships from one lane to another. I should note, by the way, this tends to be how the business thinks about certainly ocean shipping, is in terms of lanes. And if you get back to some of the stuff that Shannon was talking about earlier in terms of what's close and what's easy to move stuff, there's a real analogy with things people are probably familiar with, which is, are you right on a highway where you can zip through, or are you going through a bunch of back roads? And being 10 miles away but on a highway might be better than being 5 miles away on back roads. And so that's a lot of what happens in shipping, is there's sort of very established routes. And even if you're geographically closer, but you're not on one of those routes, it can be harder to do things. Bottom line answer, this does seem, the US is an extreme version, but it does seem to be an international problem.
Great, thank you. So Shannon, returning with this question to this idea of interdependence and sort of not too far, not too close, and what happens with regionalization. I mean, I think that we've heard a lot of talk in recent years too, just about how important interdependence is in terms of just global peace and security in a way too. And then it seems like all of a sudden we've turned against that notion. So from your vantage point, what are the pros and cons of going this more in this more regionalization direction? And where do you see that headed?
Well, I would say that this, turn towards regionalization, or the talk about more regionalization, is also something that's been happening for a long time, and it's just an acceleration. So it's not as if we went very global and then we came back down. And I think when you look at sort of the underlying data from, the 1970s, 80s on, it has been in a regional march during that whole time. So for instance, you look back at Asia and you look at intra-Asian trade, so trade within Asian countries. And, in the 1960s, 70s, it was 35, 40%, and it has grown pretty consistently to around 60%. In some areas, even higher, almost 2/3 of trade remains within Asia. So that's not a pandemic thing. That's not a supply chain crisis thing. That's something that over the last, as you saw manufacturing and supply chains blossom, they blossomed in a regional way. And, that's the Asian example. Europe has been this way for many years. And they did it, through treaties, starting with, the Treaty of Rome and all the way through all these capitals. And, you get the EU and you get the Euro and you get all this. And, their trade is anywhere between 2/3 to 75%, depending on what you're talking about. Same with, bank loans and financing and movement of people and all that kinds of things. So you get these two blocks that are very integrating. And, actually North America and the United States is the one that is more reluctant to regionalize. So you see with NAFTA, you had between Canada, Mexico, and the United States, they're still each other's largest trading partners and sources of foreign direct investment and the like. But, as NAFTA came into place, probably about 42% of its trade was within these countries. It went up to almost 50% in the decade after NAFTA. And then after China joins the WTO and in the, since the early 2000s, it's gone back down to 42% and the like. So I think this regional, especially when you think about the two or three sort of manufacturing blocks around the world, or so these regional blocks, the trend has been towards regionalization. And what we've seen over the last couple of years, and then the things that we've been talking about here, will just continue that, and I think accelerate that in many ways. So whether it is sort of these regional trade agreements that make it easier to trade with those closer to you than those further away, whether it's these resilience challenges, whether it's sort of the trust, often not always, but often there's greater trust or sort of interactions with those that are nearer than far. When companies think about going abroad, either to look for suppliers or to look for customers, they tend more often than not to go nearby. Now we can all come up with examples where that's not the case. We pick Boeing and its sources from 50 whatever different countries and it's all around, but thousands of other companies just go next door or just go within the region. And I think that trend has really been there for 3 or 4 decades and will continue even with all the technological changes and the other things that we've seen. And particularly some of these supply chain snarls that we've been talking about will reinforce that way of thinking about things as you think about looking for suppliers or customers that aren't within your home country. Oh, Courtney, you're on mute.
Whoops, thought I clicked that, but I guess not. For this last question, I'll give it to both of you. And I want to return to one of the original questions that we've been dancing around, answering in many ways this time, but it's resilience against what? So looking forward, and I'll start with you first, Phil. What would you most want to see happen in terms of building resilience? And you get to define whatever that what is, resilience against what. So what would you most like to see happen going forward? What are you looking for?
This isn't going to sound very novel. I'd like to see us move back towards a strong rules-based global trading system where people were able to source based on business decisions and where they could get quality, reliability, that you're having sort of the private sector making a lot of those decisions. This was the world we were building a decade or two back, but I think it's decayed, and I think that's left us open to some challenges, and we've only seen some of those play out.
Great, and you, Shannon?
I would agree. I worry that we're going to go into a place that is too government heavy-handed, is too involved in the way things are done, and you're not allowing the market to play itself out. That said, I do think there are some strategic reasons to look at different kinds of resilience and not just look at economic efficiency and whether the shelves are stocked. And so there are going to be strategic reasons in particular sectors to do things and to step in, and it'll make things a little bit more expensive. It will make them a little bit slower. It may make them a little bit less innovative, but it also may make the world a little bit safer. I would, though, say I don't think countries need to do that alone. I think there is something to a broader group of people. It's not, everybody pull within their shores and back off. I think this is something where we do need to return to the global space, and that is how we can do it more efficiently, but also more safely for all of us, because nothing stops at our shores.
Well, thank you both so much. I learned so much from you, and you just really made this topic, which is already quite broad, I think, you lifted it up a level. So thank you so much for your expertise and your insights. I really appreciate it. Thank you to everyone in the audience for listening, for all your questions.
Thank you for listening to Network 2020's audio edition of this virtual briefing. Click on the link in the description below to view all of our upcoming events and find out how you can become a member and gain access to our members-only benefits.